The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly in the hospital corridor as Jimmy pushed his cleaning cart toward room 214. It was his last round for the day, and his back ached from hours of bending and scrubbing. He rubbed the back of his neck, glanced at the clock, and quietly opened the door. Inside, the room was dim. The patient, a man in his early 30s, lay motionless on the bed. The name on the chart read Jack S. A gauze patch was taped above. His left brow and his arm rested in a sling. Machines beeped softly, tracking vitals, steady and calm. Jimmy moved silently, careful not to disturb the peace. He swept the floor, wiped the window, and adjusted the tray table. Jack didn't stir, but as Jimmy turned to leave, hand reaching for the doorknob, a voice, gravelly, tired, cut through the silence. "Stop. What are you trying to steal?" Jimmy froze. He turned slowly to find Jack's eyes open, staring directly at him. There was no panic in his tone, just suspicion. Jimmy's brows lifted in surprise. "Nothing, sir," he replied evenly. "Just doing my job." Jack narrowed his eyes, scanning Jimmy from head to toe, as though weighing the truth of those words. "You were in my bag." "I wasn't. I just wiped the floor near it." "I didn't touch a thing," Jimmy said, his voice firm but respectful. He was used to being mistaken, judged. His second-hand uniform, his worn-out shoes, they all spoke, before he did. Jack said nothing. His gaze lingered a moment longer before drifting away, as if the effort to stay angry was too much. Jimmy hesitated, then added, "You dropped your water bottle earlier." "I left it on the table." Jack glanced over, then back at him. "You always this defensive?" "Only when I'm accused of something I didn't do." Silence stretched between them, long enough for Jimmy to feel the weight of it settle. He turned again, hand on the door. "Wait," Jack said, softer now. "What's your name?" "Jimmy." Jack nodded, then looked away. "Thanks for cleaning." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was something. Jimmy offered a slight smile, nodded, and stepped into the hallway, letting the door close behind him. As he walked back down the corridor, he found himself thinking about Jack's voice, how guarded it sounded, how lonely. He'd cleaned hundreds of rooms, but something about this one clung to him. Back in room 214, Jack stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The quiet was the same as always, but now it felt heavier, interrupted. Not by fear, but by something else he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the way Jimmy stood his ground, or maybe after days of silence, he just needed someone to see him. Either way, Jack knew he'd be listening next time the door opened. The next morning, Jack sat upright, in bed, alert to every sound beyond his door. He wasn't expecting anyone specific, but when Jimmy entered with the same quiet focus, a strange sense of relief washed over him. Jimmy offered a polite nod, his eyes briefly meeting Jack's before he moved to the corner of the room. "You again," Jack muttered, his voice less hostile than before. Jimmy glanced up. "Someone's got to keep this place from turning into a mess." Jack studied him. Jimmy's movements were efficient, focused, not hurried. His sleeves were rolled up just below the elbow, exposing faint bruises along his forearm, as if life had marked him in places no one cared to notice. "You always this thorough?" Jack asked, less to challenge and more to understand. Jimmy paused. "I like clean places. Chaos messes with my head." Jack gave a short nod, his lips twitching, into the ghost of a smirk. "You and I have something in common then." That earned a small laugh from Jimmy. He set down the bin and approached the windowsill, where a small bouquet of wilted daisies sat in a plastic cup. "Mind if I toss these?" Jack shrugged. They were from a nurse, pity flowers. Jimmy picked up the cup but returned moments later with a small bundle of fresh wildflowers he'd brought from home. He placed them in a rinsed container beside Jack's bed without explanation. Jack blinked. "You bring flowers for all your patients?" Jimmy straightened. arms crossed lightly. "Only the ones who think I'm a thief." That broke the tension. Jack chuckled, then winced as the movement pulled at his shoulder. "You're strange," Jack murmured. "Better than invisible," Jimmy replied, the words slipping out before he could stop them. They both paused. Jack recognized something in that statement, something raw. The conversation quieted, but the silence wasn't empty. It was curious, shared. "Where are you from?" Jack asked finally. "East Side, not the nice part. Been working since I was 16. My mom's not well, so hospitals are kind of my second home." Jack's expression softened. "You're too young to carry that much." Jimmy shrugged. "Life doesn't care how old you are." There was no self-pity in his voice, just truth. Jack found himself wanting to ask more, to understand the quiet strength in the man who scrubbed floors with more dignity than half the executives Jack had known. The intercom buzzed overhead, calling, "Jimmy to another wing." He gathered his supplies, paused at the door and said, "I'll be back tomorrow." Jack nodded, trying not to look too eager. When the door closed, Jack leaned back against his pillows, staring at the wildflowers. They weren't fancy. They didn't smell like anything. But they were real. And for the first time in weeks, something inside him stirred. Something he thought he'd buried after everything he'd lost. 2 weeks later, Jack was no longer a patient. His discharge papers had been signed, his wounds stitched and healing. But something within him remained unsettled. He sat in his quiet apartment, the silence far louder than any hospital machine. Despite the soft hum of city life beyond the windows, all he could think about was Jimmy, his voice, his presence, the quiet calm he brought to every chaotic corner. Jack hadn't asked for Jimmy's number. Pride, perhaps, or fear. But now, he found himself calling the hospital under the pretense of returning a misplaced item. With a little charm and a vague explanation, he got what he wanted. That evening, Jack waited nervously in a small cafe, hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long gone cold. When the door opened and Jimmy stepped in, wearing a simple jacket and cautious eyes, Jack stood. "You didn't have to call," Jimmy said, sliding into the seat across from him. "I know," Jack replied, "but I wanted to." Conversation flowed easier than expected. They spoke of small things at first, weather, books, street food, but underneath, something deeper pulled them closer. Jack invited Jimmy over the following weekend. It wasn't impulsive. It felt natural, as if they'd known each other longer than reality allowed. In Jack's apartment, things unfolded with unspoken tenderness. They stood on the balcony, sharing quiet glances under the city lights. When Jack leaned in, Jimmy didn't pull away. The kiss was slow, unsure, yet filled with everything they couldn't say aloud. In that moment, they both believed in something, fragile but real. But belief is often tested. 2 days later, Jack received a message from an unknown number. It read simply, "Your cleaner boyfriend is a thief. Ask security." Attached was a blurry photo, Jimmy walking through a hospital corridor with a small bag in his hand. Jack stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. His mind, once a safe space, spiraled. Old betrayals whispered through his thoughts, memories of a fiancé who'd lied, stolen, vanished. Could he be wrong again? That evening, when Jimmy arrived at the apartment, he sensed the shift instantly. Jack stood stiffly by the window, arms crossed, the photo open on the table. "You think that's me?" Jimmy asked, voice quiet. Jack said nothing. "I've never stolen anything. Ever," Jimmy continued. "I work 12-hour shifts. I clean up people's messes, and still, I'm just a suspect." Jack couldn't look at him. "I don't know what to believe." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Jimmy exhaled, nodded slowly, and turned toward the door. "I thought you were different." and then he was gone. Jack stared at the door for a long time after it closed, the weight of his doubt settling deeper than any wound he'd carried before. Somewhere inside, a truth flickered, but by the time he reached for it, it was already slipping away. The days that followed were quiet, but not in a peaceful way. Jack went through them distracted and disoriented, his routines mechanical. He deleted the message but couldn't erase the image. Jimmy's absence echoed through his apartment like a broken chord, unresolved. Every time he passed the flowers on the windowsill, now wilting, he remembered the way Jimmy had looked at him, hurt layered over something deeper. Disappointment. 1. Evening, unable to stand the weight of it any longer, Jack returned to the hospital. He didn't ask for Jimmy. Instead, he watched from a distance, waiting near the loading dock, uncertain of what he'd even say if he saw him. When Jimmy finally emerged, carrying a mop bucket and pushing a cart stacked with linens, Jack stepped out of the shadows. Jimmy froze. "Here to accuse me again?" Jack shook his head, ashamed. "I'm here to apologize." Jimmy didn't respond, only leaned on the handle of the cart, guarded. Jack took a step forward. "That photo, it wasn't even clear. I let a stranger's word mean more than yours, and that's on me. But I didn't come here to make excuses." Jimmy's jaw clenched. "You let doubt win, just like everyone else." "I know," Jack said softly. "But I didn't stop thinking about you. Not once." Jimmy looked away, torn between the sting of betrayal and the pull of something unfinished. Jack continued, "You made me feel seen again, like I wasn't just broken pieces in a hospital bed, and I threw that away the moment things got hard." For a long beat, Jimmy said nothing. Then slowly, he pushed the cart aside and stepped closer. "You want the truth?" he said. "That bag in the photo, it belonged to a patient. I was returning it to the front desk. That's what the security footage would have shown. But you never asked. You just looked at me the way the world always has." Jack's throat tightened. "I made a mistake. I let my past shape how I saw you, but I don't want to let fear decide anymore." Silence stretched between them. Not hostile this time, but hesitant. Jimmy studied him, trying to decide whether to open the door again or leave it shut for good. Finally, Jimmy sighed. "I don't need saving, Jack. But I did think, maybe you needed someone too." "I do," Jack said, without hesitation. Jimmy looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, one chance, that's all." Jack smiled faintly. "I won't waste it." As they stood under the cold flicker of a parking lot light, something between them quietly mended. Not perfect, not certain, but real. Sometimes, trust is not about never doubting, but about choosing to believe anyway. And that night,